In the winter of 1745, something happened in the Mohawk Valley of New York that the people in charge buried so deep it took almost 300 years for the truth to come out. 17 families, 43 men, women and children, all dead in a bunch of terrible attacks that should never have happened. The attacks followed a plan so perfect, so thought out that people who survived whispered about an invisible puppet master making all the killing happen from hiding places. What they didn't know was that their puppet master was 11 years old, could speak 3 languages really well, and had turned killing entire groups of people into a family business. The name Jonas Creighton shows up in exactly 3 papers from the government from that winter. Each time it was marked with a special note that smart people who study history have only recently figured out what it means. It means sealed by the governor's order. Before we keep going with the story of the boy who turned war into money and death into an art form, I need you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Because this dark part of American history touches every corner of our nation's bloody beginning, the truth about Jonas Creighton didn't come from dusty old books or forgotten letters. It came from the dying words of a Mohawk elder in 1823. Written down by a missionary who right away sealed the paper and begged his bosses to never let it see daylight. The Mohawk Valley in 1745 stretched like an open wound across central New York, a hallway of scattered settlements hanging on to the edges of civilization. King George's War raged between the French and British, turning the American frontier into a chess game where the pieces you could lose were measured in human lives. The valley's people, Dutch landowners, German people who moved there, Scottish-Irish frontier people, and English traders lived in constant fear of French Allied war parties sweeping down from Canada. Fort Hunter stood as the area's main trading post, a falling-apart collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a 12-foot fence made of logs. Here, in a large stone house that was used as both a home and warehouse, lived Hamish Creighton, one of the most successful gun dealers on the colonial frontier. Creighton had moved from Glasgow in 1738, bringing with him a sharp understanding of European weapon-making and an even sharper sense for profit in times of chaos. The Creighton household was a small example of frontier complexity. Hamish hired 2 Mohawk interpreters, a French trapper who'd switched sides, and a former servant from Virginia who kept the book. His wife Margaret had died giving birth to their only child, Jonas, in 1734. The boy grew up surrounded by the conversations of war, the noise of muskets being cleaned, and the careful negotiations that meant the difference between peace and bloodshed. Jonas Creighton was no ordinary child. By age 7, he spoke perfect English, Dutch and Mohawk. His father's business required constant talking with various groups, and the boy had proven very valuable as a translator and messenger. Standing barely 4 feet tall with sharp grey eyes, and a disturbing stillness about him, Jonas moved through the complicated world of frontier politics like a ghost watching a play. The winter of 1744 had been particularly harsh, and spring brought news that chilled the blood of every valley resident. French forces under the command of Captain Paul Marouin had been spotted moving south from Lake Champlain. More disturbing were reports of Abenaki and Huron war parties being supplied with fresh British weapons that seemed suspiciously similar to those in Hamish Creighton's inventory. In May of 1745, Hamish received a visitor that would change everything. Captain Edmund Stockwell of the New York Colonial Militia arrived at Fort Hunter with disturbing news. Someone was playing both sides of the conflict, selling weapons to hostile tribes while at the same time arming colonial militias. The practice was not just treason, it was a death sentence for innocent families caught in the crossfire. The morning of June 14, 1745, dawned clear and unnaturally quiet. Jonas Creighton sat in his father's study, carefully copying inventory lists in his precise adult-like handwriting. Through the window, he could see 2 Mohawk warriors approaching the trading post. He recognized them right away. Ben's brother, Karanati, and a younger warrior named Konwatiti. Both men carried themselves with the tension of those bringing important news. Hamish was checking a shipment of muskets that had arrived from Albany the previous day. The weapons were of exceptional quality, British Brown best muskets with changes that made them lighter and more accurate than standard military issue. Jonas watched his father's hands move over the weapons with the respect of a craftsman, appreciating fine work. When Cariniati entered the study, his face was serious. The French captain sends word, he said in heavily accented English. His warriors need more of the fire sticks, the ones with the silver bands around the stock. He pointed toward the window where a small group of Huron warriors waited in the shadows of the tree line. Jonas felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, but excitement. He understood what was happening in a way that even his father didn't quite grasp. These weren't just business deals. They were pieces of a huge game where information was more valuable than gunpowder, and the right word whispered to the right person could tip the balance of power across hundreds of square miles. "Tell the French captain his warriors will have their weapons," Hamish replied carefully. "But the price has gone up. British patrols have made transport more dangerous." After the Mohawk left, Jonas approached his father with the careful manner he'd perfected over years of watching. "Papa, what if the British knew the French were getting weapons with silver stock bands?" Hamish looked at his son sharply. "That's not information for children, Jonas." But if someone told them, the boy continued with innocent curiosity. Wouldn't they want to know where those weapons came from? Wouldn't they pay for such information? The idea that formed in Hamish's mind wasn't his own. It was planted there by his 11-year-old son with the precision of a surgeon inserting a scalpel. Within the week, Hamish had made contact with British intelligence officers, offering to serve as a double agent. What he didn't realise was that Jonas had already begun his own letter writing letters in 3 languages to various military commanders, traders, and tribal leaders throughout the region. Jonas's first independent operation began with an overheard conversation between 2 Dutch traders discussing the Vanderburg family farm. Peter Vanderburg had moved from New Amsterdam in 1739, establishing a successful homestead along the Mohawk River, where he raised cattle and grew wheat for the Albany market. His wife, Greer, was known throughout the valley for her skill with medicinal herbs, often trading her remedies for goods the family couldn't produce themselves. The Vanderburgs represented exactly what Jonas was looking for, a family successful enough to matter, but isolated enough to be vulnerable More importantly, Peter had recently begun trading directly with French agents, bypassing established middlemen like Hamish Creighton, a business decision that had reduced the Creighton family's profits by nearly 15%. On June 28th, Jonas visited the Vanderburg farm under the pretense of delivering a message from his father about medicine for a made-up sick trader. While Greacher prepared a packet of willow bark tea, Jonas engaged Peter in conversation about recent French activity in the region. The boy's questions seemed innocent, a child's natural curiosity about the exciting world of adult business. "The French captain who buys Papa's muskets," Jonas said with wide-eyed interest. He told Papa that some farmers are helping French soldiers hide from British patrols. "Papa says that's very dangerous for those families if the British find out." Peter's face tightened with concern. What farmers did the captain mention names? "I wasn't supposed to hear," Jonas replied with perfect childlike guilt, "but I think he said something about Dutch families near the river." Papa got very angry and told him that would bring trouble to innocent people. The seed was planted with surgical precision. Jonas had given Peter Vanderburg just enough information to create fear without providing specific details that could be checked. The implication was clear. French agents were involving local families in military operations without their knowledge or consent, and British authorities were becoming suspicious of Dutch settlers' loyalty. 3 days later, Peter Vanderburg appeared at Fort Hunter demanding to speak with British representatives about his family's loyalty to the Crown. The meeting, arranged through Hamish Creighton's contacts, put the Vanderburgs on British intelligence lists as a family worth watching exactly where Jonas wanted them. The boy's next move demonstrated a sophistication that would have impressed professional spies. Through his network of tribal contacts, Jonas learned that a small Huron war party was planning to raid isolated farms along the Mohawk River, targeting families believed to be cooperating with British forces. The raids were intended as warnings rather than massacres, quick strikes designed to discourage colonial cooperation with British military operations. Jonas saw an opportunity to turn a warning into a tragedy. On July 8th, he visited the Huron camp with information he claimed to have overheard from British scouts. The Vanderburg farm, he told the war party leader in fluent Mohawk, was being used as a meeting place for British officers and colonial militia commanders. The family was actively providing intelligence about French and tribal movements. Information that had already led to the capture of 2 French scouts and the deaths of 3 Huron warriors. The information was carefully crafted to transform the planned warning raid into a revenge killing. Jonas provided specific details about the farm's layout, the family's daily routines, and the weapons they supposedly kept for British visitors. Most importantly, he told the war party that British officers would be meeting at the farm on July 12th, a lie that would guarantee maximum violence when no officers appeared. At the same time, Jonas was working the British angle with equal precision. Through his father's intelligence contacts, he passed along information about increased Huron activity near Dutch settlements. The intelligence suggested that French agents were pressuring Dutch families to provide support for upcoming military operations, using threats against their property and livestock to ensure cooperation. The boy's masterstroke was a fake letter supposedly intercepted from French agents that specifically mentioned the Vanderburg farm as a staging area for operations against British positions. The letter, written in Jonas's careful hand using French phrases he'd learned from traders, provided just enough authentic detail to pass casual inspection while containing enough suspicious elements to justify immediate British intervention. On the morning of July 12th, a British patrol led by Sergeant Timothy Hewlett approached the Vanderburg farm to investigate reports of French collaboration. At almost the same moment, 12 Huron warriors were surrounding the property, preparing to attack what they believed to be a gathering of British officers and their Dutch collaborators. The massacre that followed lasted less than an hour. Peter Vanderburg died trying to protect his family from attackers whose language he couldn't understand and whose presence he couldn't explain. Greichen was killed while attempting to reach their children, who were hiding in the root cellar. The British patrol arriving to find the farm under attack engaged the Huron warriors in a firefight that left 5 soldiers and 7 warriors dead. When the smoke cleared, the Vanderburg farm was a smoking ruin. An entire family had been destroyed along with nearly a dozen soldiers and warriors. All because an 11-year-old boy had whispered the right lies to the right people at precisely the right time. Jonas observed the aftermath of the Vanderburg massacre with the detached fascination of a scientist studying experimental results. The boy had learned valuable lessons about timing, information flow, and the psychological triggers that could transform routine military operations into bloodbaths. The most important discovery was that people's existing fears and suspicions made them eager to believe information that confirmed their worst expectations. Peter Vanderburg had been worried about French involvement with Dutch settlers, so he'd readily accepted Jonas's implications about his neighbours' loyalties. The Huron War Party had been angry about British cooperation with colonial families, making them receptive to stories about Dutch collaboration. British officers had been concerned about French infiltration of Dutch settlements, causing them to treat Jonas's fake letter as credible intelligence. Each group had heard exactly what they expected to hear, and their predictable reactions had created a perfect storm of violence that served Jonas's ultimate goal, maximizing demand for his father's weapons while eliminating business competition. In the week following the Vanderburg massacre, Hamish Creighton sold 37 muskets to local Dutch families terrified of Indian attacks, 24 pistols to British officers concerned about settler loyalty, and a substantial quantity of gunpowder to French agents seeking to arm their tribal allies for revenge operations. The destruction of one family had generated enough fear and suspicion to fuel weapon sales across 3 different factions. Jonas recorded these transactions in his private journal with the same meticulous attention he gave to his father's official inventory lists. But the boy's records included additional details that would have horrified anyone who discovered them. Fine. Precise calculations of the relationship between casualties and profits, detailed observations about the psychological vulnerabilities of different ethnic and military groups, and careful notes about the optimal timing for introducing false intelligence into complex political situations. By mid-July, Jonas Creighton had transformed from an unusually intelligent child into something far more dangerous. A master manipulator who understood that information could be more deadly than gunpowder, and that the right lie told to the right person could kill more effectively than any weapon his father's shop could provide. By late June, Jonas Creighton had become the invisible centre of a communication network that stretched from the Hudson River to Lake Ontario. Using his father's established connections and his own remarkable linguistic abilities, the boy began orchestrating a series of misunderstandings that would escalate minor skirmishes into full-scale atrocities. His method was elegantly simple: selective information sharing. When British scouts reported French troop movements, Jonas would ensure that certain details were left out or exaggerated in the reports that reached colonial commanders. When Mohawk war parties planned raids on isolated farmsteads, Jonas would provide just enough warning to some settlements while ensuring others remained completely unaware of approaching danger. The first test came on July 2nd. Jonas learned from a Huron messenger that a small war party planned to attack the Henderson farm, an isolated homestead 15 miles north of Fort Hunter. The family consisted of Thomas Henderson, his wife Sarah, and their 3 young children. They were vulnerable, defenseless, and most importantly, from Jonas's perspective, their deaths would generate enough outrage to justify a massive increase in weapon sales to local militias. But Jonas's plan was more sophisticated than simple murder. 3 days before the planned attack, he sent word to Thomas Henderson through a Dutch trader, warning him that French agents had been spotted in the area and suggesting that the family might want to visit relatives in Albany for a few weeks. The message was carefully crafted to sound like friendly advice rather than a specific warning. Henderson, a proud Scottish-Irish farmer who'd fought in previous conflicts, responded exactly as Jonas had calculated. Rather than flee, he sent word to neighbouring farms, organising a small defensive force. By the night of July 5th, 12 armed men had gathered at the Henderson farm, turning what should have been a simple raid into a potential massacre. Jonas's next move revealed the full depth of his calculation. On the morning of the attack, he visited the Huron camp and spoke with the war party leader in fluent Mohawk, passing along information he claimed to have overheard from British scouts. The farm, he told them, was defended by only old men and boys. Colonial militia had been withdrawn to defend Albany from a French advance. The weapons they'd purchased from his father, Jonas assured them, would make quick work of any resistance. The battle at Henderson Farm lasted 3 hours. When it ended, 7 colonists lay dead, including Thomas Henderson and 2 of his children. 5 Huron warriors had also been killed, including the war party leader who trusted a child's intelligence. The survivors on both sides retreated with stories of treachery and superior enemy preparation that made no logical sense. Within a week, Hamish Creighton had sold 47 muskets to newly formed colonial militias, 62 pounds of gunpowder to French agents, and a case of pistols to Mohawk warriors seeking revenge for their fallen comrades. The boy who orchestrated the entire sequence sat in his father's study, carefully recording each transaction in his precise handwriting, calculating profits that were measured in both coins and corpses. By August of 1745, Jonas had expanded his operations beyond simple information manipulation. The boy had recognized that his father's trading post was just one node in a vast commercial network that stretched from Montreal to Albany, connecting French agents, British officials, tribal representatives, and independent merchants in a web of relationships that could be exploited for maximum profit. Through careful observation and strategic conversations, Jonas mapped this network with the precision of a military cartographer. He learned that Isaac Clarke, a German immigrant who operated a rival trading post near the Noses settlement, was experiencing financial difficulties due to increased French military activity. Abraham Yates, a Dutch merchant from Schenectady, was seeking new suppliers for British Army contracts. Samuel Wells, an English trader based in Albany, had been asking questions about French weapon purchases that suggested possible intelligence connections. Each of these merchants represented both an opportunity and a threat. Jonas understood that controlling information flow between them could determine not just his family's profits, but the entire balance of power in the regional arms trade. The boy began crafting a series of operations designed to eliminate competitors while expanding his father's market share through carefully orchestrated violence. His first target was Isaac Clarke, whose German Lutheran background made him naturally suspicious of French Catholic influences, while his financial desperation made him vulnerable to manipulation. Jonas learned from Mohawk contacts that Clarke had been approached by French agents seeking to establish a weapons cache near his trading post, an offer that the struggling merchant had reluctantly accepted. The boy saw an opportunity to destroy a competitor while simultaneously creating new demand for weapons. Through his father's British intelligence contacts, Jonas arranged for information about Clarke's French connections to reach colonial authorities. But the intelligence he provided was carefully modified to suggest that Clarke was voluntarily collaborating with enemy agents rather than being forced by financial necessity. At the same time, Jonas was feeding different information to French contacts, suggesting that Clarke was planning to betray French operations to British authorities in exchange for colonial protection and financial support. The boy's genius lay in making both accusations technically true, while ensuring that neither side understood the full context of Clarke's situation. The destruction of Isaac Clarke's trading operation began with a pre-dawn raid by British colonial militia on August 23rd. The soldiers acting on intelligence that suggested Clarke was storing weapons for French military operations discovered exactly what Jonas had predicted. A cache of muskets and gunpowder that Clarke couldn't explain without admitting to French connections that would confirm his apparent treasonous activities. Before Clarke could be formally arrested, a Huron war party attacked the militia patrol, apparently attempting to recover weapons that French agents claimed had been stolen by a traitorous German merchant. The firefight that followed destroyed Clarke's trading post, killed 6 colonial soldiers and 4 Huron warriors, and left Isaac Clarke himself dead from wounds received during the crossfire. Within a month, Hamish Creighton had acquired most of Clarke's former trade routes and customer relationships, expanding his business operations to include German settlements that had previously been outside his commercial reach. The eliminated competition allowed the Creighton to raise prices while reducing the quality of service. Knowing that desperate customers had few alternatives in the increasingly violent frontier environment, Jonas's next operation targeted the supply chain that connected frontier trading posts with major commercial centers like Albany and New York City. The boy had learned that weapon shipments followed predictable routes and schedules, making them vulnerable to coordinated attacks that could appear accidental while serving specific business purposes. Samuel Wells, the Albany-based trader who'd been asking suspicious questions about French weapon purchases, represented both a threat to the Creighton family security and an opportunity to demonstrate Jonas' growing influence over regional military operations. Through careful investigation, Jonas discovered that Wells was indeed working with British intelligence services, gathering information about French military supply operations for use in planning future raids and ambushes. The boy's response was characteristically sophisticated. Rather than simply eliminating Wells, Jonas decided to use the merchant's intelligence connections to orchestrate a series of attacks that would simultaneously destroy French military supplies, eliminate British intelligence assets, and create new opportunities for Creighton family profit. Working through his network of tribal contacts, Jonas provided French agents with detailed intelligence about British supply convoys travelling between Albany and frontier trading posts. The information was accurate enough to enable successful attacks while being timed to ensure maximum disruption of British military operations. But Jonas's intelligence came with subtle modifications that would guarantee French victories while creating long-term strategic disadvantages. The boy told French commanders that British convoys were lightly defended and carrying primarily commercial goods, rather than military supplies. This intelligence encouraged aggressive attacks that would capture valuable weapons and ammunition. What Jonas didn't mention was that these particular convoys were being used to transport Samuel Wells and other British intelligence operatives to frontier meetings with colonial agents. The ambush of the September 14th convoy achieved exactly what Jonas had planned. French forces expecting to capture a lightly defended commercial shipment instead found themselves attacking a military escort protecting British intelligence personnel. The resulting battle lasted 4 hours and ended with the destruction of both the convoy and most of the French raiding party. Samuel Wells died in the fighting, along with 2 other British agents whose intelligence operations had posed potential threats to Jonas's activities. But the French forces also suffered casualties that significantly reduced their capacity for future military operations in the region. Most importantly, from Jonas's perspective, the attack created immediate demand for replacement weapons and supplies from both British and French sources. The boys' most ambitious operation during this period involved manipulating the delicate relationship between British colonial authorities and their Oneida allies. The Oneida had remained generally loyal to British interests throughout the escalating conflict, providing scouts and warriors for operations against French positions, while resisting French attempts to recruit them for anti-British campaigns. Jonas recognized that this loyalty represented both a strategic asset for British forces and a potential vulnerability that could be exploited for maximum profit. If the Oneida could be convinced that British authorities were planning to betray their alliance, their reaction would create immediate opportunities for French military advances, while generating massive demand for weapons from panicked colonial settlement. The operation began with Jonas carefully studying Oneida political structures and identifying key decision-makers within the tribal council. Through his Mohawk contacts, he learned that Shenandoah, an influential Oneida war chief, had been expressing private concerns about British long-term intentions regarding tribal lands and sovereignty. These concerns provided Jonas with the psychological pressure points he needed to destabilize the British Oneida alliance. Using information gathered from British intelligence contacts, Jonas learned about planned military operations that could be presented to Oneida leaders as evidence of British treachery. A proposed raid on French positions near Lake Ontario required coordination with tribal allies. But the operational details included provisions for establishing permanent British military posts in traditional Oneida territory. Jonas saw an opportunity to use accurate information in a false context to achieve devastating results. Through carefully orchestrated conversations with Oneida representatives, he suggested that the proposed military posts were not temporary strategic positions, but permanent installations designed to control tribal movements and limit their traditional hunting and trading activities. The boys' manipulation was subtle and sophisticated. Rather than directly accusing British authorities of planning to betray their Oneida allies, Jonas simply asked innocent questions about the long-term implications of increased British military presence in Oneida territory. His childlike curiosity made these questions seem natural, while planting seeds of suspicion that would grow into full-blown paranoia under the right circumstances. At the same time, Jonas was feeding complementary intelligence to British contacts, suggesting that French agents had been successful in recruiting Oneida warriors for operations against colonial settlements. This intelligence was technically accurate. French agents had indeed approached Oneida leaders, but Jonas's reports exaggerated both the scope of French recruitment efforts and the likelihood of Oneida cooperation. The collision between these two deception campaigns occurred during a crucial meeting between British officers and Oneida representatives on October 3rd. Captain Edmund Stockwell, acting on Jonas's intelligence about French recruitment, approached the meeting with suspicion and demands for stronger demonstrations of Oneida loyalty. Shenandoah, influenced by Jonas's suggestions about British territorial ambitions, interpreted Stockwell's demands as confirmation of planned betrayal. The breakdown of British Oneida negotiations had immediate military consequences. Oneida warriors, who had been scheduled to participate in British operations against French positions instead, remained neutral, leaving colonial forces dangerously exposed during subsequent campaigns. More seriously, the diplomatic crisis encouraged French agents to intensify their recruitment efforts among other tribal groups, creating new threats that British forces were unprepared to handle. Jonas observed these developments with satisfaction that bordered on scientific fascination. The boy had successfully manipulated two separate political entities into mutual suspicion and hostility, using nothing more than carefully timed questions and selectively shared information. The resulting military complications would generate weapons sales, create new intelligence-gathering opportunities, and eliminate potential threats to his family's commercial dominance. But Jonas's greatest achievement was something that even he didn't fully recognize at the time. He had demonstrated that information warfare could be more effective than conventional military operations in destabilizing enemy alliances and creating strategic advantages. The 11-year-old had essentially invented techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized by intelligence professionals for another 2 centuries. As summer turned to autumn, Jonas's operations became increasingly sophisticated. He'd learned that the key to successful manipulation wasn't just providing false information. It was providing true information to the wrong people at the wrong times. A real French troop movement reported to colonial militia a day late could result in an ambush. Accurate intelligence about British supply convoys shared with hostile tribes could trigger retaliatory raids that would kill dozens. The boy's greatest innovation was what he privately called the echo method. Jonas would overhear or engineer a piece of intelligence, then carefully modify it as it passed through his network of contacts. By the time information reached its final destination, it bore only a passing resemblance to the original facts, but each modification served Jonas's ultimate goal, maximizing conflict and therefore weapons sale. On September 18th, Jonas learned that Captain Stockwell was planning a major offensive against French positions near Lake George. The operation involved coordinating attacks with Oneida allies while preventing Mohawk warriors from joining French forces. It was exactly the type of complex military planning that offered multiple opportunities for profitable sabotage. Jonas began by visiting his friend Tekita, a young Mohawk woman who served as an interpreter for various tribal councils. He shared with her his concerns about British plans to establish permanent forts on traditional Mohawk hunting grounds. Information that was technically accurate, but presented in a context that made it sound like an immediate threat rather than a long-term possibility. Tekita, trusting the boy who'd grown up among her people and spoken their language since childhood, shared this intelligence with her uncle, a respected war chief named Canon Warohara. Within days, Canon Warohara was organizing Mohawk support for French forces. Support that Captain Stockwell was counting on not happening. At the same time, Jonas was feeding different information to British contacts. Through his father's business correspondence, he let slip that French forces had received detailed intelligence about British troop movements, suggesting a spy in colonial ranks. This information, technically true since Jonas himself was providing intelligence to French agents, created paranoia and mistrust that hampered British military effectiveness. The battle near Lake George was a catastrophe for both sides. British forces expecting Oneida support that never materialized and facing unexpected Mohawk resistance lost 37 men in a day-long fight that accomplished nothing. French casualties were equally severe, and the mutual slaughter accomplished exactly what Jonas had intended. Both sides desperately needed new weapons, ammunition and supplies. In the week following the Lake George disaster, Hamish Creighton processed the largest weapon orders of his career. British agents purchased everything he had in stock and placed orders for additional shipments from Albany and New York City. French representatives operating through Huron intermediaries bought gunpowder, shot, and maintenance supplies. Various tribal factions acquired pistols, knives, and specialized ammunition for different types of warfare. Jonas watched the transactions with satisfaction that bordered on scientific fascination. He'd created a perfect system. Conflict generated demand. Demand generated profit, and profit provided the resources to create more conflict. Each death was both a tragedy and a business opportunity. Each military disaster, a chance to sell solutions to the problems he'd helped create. October had brought the first harsh frost to the Mohawk Valley, and with them came intelligence that would provide Jonas Creighton with his greatest opportunity for orchestrated destruction. Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel's supply convoy represented more than just another French military operation. It was the convergence point where Jonas could bring together months of careful manipulation in one devastating crescendo of violence. The boys' preparation for what would become the Deer Creek Massacre began with a detailed study of military logistics and communication systems. Jonas had learned that successful operations required not just the manipulation of information, but the precise timing of its release to ensure maximum destructive potential. Like a composer arranging a symphony of death, he began orchestrating the movements of 3 separate military forces toward a single, inevitable collision. His first challenge was understanding the French convoy's actual mission and composition. Through his network of tribal contacts, Jonas learned that Captain Taffanel was transporting not just routine supplies, but a substantial payroll intended for French forces throughout the region, along with specialized weapons and ammunition for upcoming winter operations. This intelligence provided Jonas with the foundation for the elaborate deceptions he would construct around the convoy's true nature. The boys' second challenge was more complex, creating believable but false intelligence that would motivate British and tribal forces to converge on the convoy's location at precisely the right moment. This required not just understanding military procedures, but anticipating the psychological responses of individual commanders to different types of threats and opportunities. Jonas's manipulation of British intelligence began with Captain Edmund Stockwell, whose suspicions about colonial loyalty had been carefully cultivated through previous operations. The boy had learned that Stockwell was under pressure from his superiors to demonstrate results against French operations, making him particularly receptive to intelligence that promised significant tactical victories. Through his father's intelligence contacts, Jonas provided Stockwell with a series of reports that gradually built a compelling but false picture of the French convoy's importance. The first report delivered in mid-October suggested that French forces were planning major operations against colonial settlements, requiring substantial financial resources and specialized equipment. The second report, timed to arrive just as British scouts were beginning to track French movements, indicated that a high-value target was moving through the region, carrying resources essential to French winter campaigns. The boy's genius lay in combining accurate details with strategic omissions and modifications. The French convoy was indeed carrying valuable supplies. Jonas's intelligence was technically correct, but his report suggested that the convoy was lightly defended and carrying a payroll chest worth far more than its actual contents, while omitting crucial information about the escort size and military capabilities. More importantly, Jonas timed the release of this intelligence to coincide with other intelligence, suggesting that French agents were planning coordinated attacks on British positions throughout the region. This created a psychological context where attacking the convoy appeared to be a defensive necessity rather than an opportunistic raid, making British commanders more likely to commit substantial forces to the operation. Jonas's manipulation of tribal forces required even greater sophistication, as he needed to present the same convoy as both a threat requiring military response and an opportunity requiring protection. The boy had learned that different tribal groups responded to different psychological triggers, allowing him to craft customized deceptions for each audience. For the Mohawk war party led by Karen Hayaktati, Jonas presented the convoy as a peaceful trading expedition, carrying winter supplies promised to tribal families as compensation for losses suffered in recent conflicts. This intelligence transformed a military target into a humanitarian mission that required protection from British aggression. The boy's presentation of this information was masterfully crafted. Rather than simply lying about the convoy's nature, Jonas selectively emphasized certain aspects of its mission while minimizing others. The convoy was indeed carrying supplies that could benefit tribal communities, trade goods and materials that French agents routinely used to maintain tribal alliances. Jonas simply exaggerated the humanitarian aspects while minimizing the military components. More deviously, Jonas provided Mohawk leaders with intelligence about British plans to attack peaceful trading expeditions. Intelligence that was technically accurate, but presented without the context that would explain British motivations. Colonial forces were indeed planning to intercept French convoys, but their target was military supplies rather than humanitarian aid. For other tribal groups, Jonas crafted different versions of the same basic deception. Huron warriors learned that British forces were planning to steal French gifts intended for tribal families. Abnaki scouts were told that colonial militia were preparing to attack neutral trading parties as part of a broader campaign against tribal sovereignty. Each group received intelligence that appealed to their specific concerns and grievances, while being carefully timed to ensure that their responses would converge on the convoy's location at precisely the moment when maximum conflict was inevitable. Jonas's most sophisticated manipulation involved the French convoy itself. The boy recognized that Captain Taffanel's decisions about routes, timing and defensive preparations could determine whether the planned convergence resulted in a minor skirmish or a major disaster. By providing French commanders with carefully crafted intelligence about British and tribal movements, Jonas could influence these decisions in ways that would maximize casualties on all sides. Through Henry Dubois, the French trader who served as Jonas's primary contact with French military operations, the boy provided Captain Taffanel with intelligence about British troop movements that was accurate enough to be credible while being timed to encourage tactically disastrous decisions. Jonas reported that large British forces were moving toward French positions near Lake George, creating pressure for rapid completion of the convoy's mission. This intelligence encouraged Taffanel to accelerate his schedule and reduce the size of his escort, believing that British attention was focused elsewhere. At the same time, Jonas provided French commanders with intelligence about tribal movements that suggested strong native support for French operations in the region. This intelligence encouraged Taffanel to expect friendly reception from tribal forces he might encounter, while being unaware that some of these same forces had been convinced that his convoy posed a threat to their communities. The boy's manipulation of French intelligence was particularly cruel because it exploited Captain Taffanel's genuine concern for his men's safety. By suggesting that the greatest threats lay in directions away from the convoy's actual route, Jonas encouraged tactical decisions that would place French forces in maximum danger, while believing they were taking prudent defensive measures. By November 20th, Jonas had successfully manipulated 3 separate military forces into believing that their converging movements were necessary responses to legitimate threats and opportunities. British forces under Lieutenant Colonel William Johnson were preparing to attack what they believed was a lightly defended but high-value French target. Mohawk warriors, led by Karen Hayek-Tati, were mobilizing to protect what they understood to be a peaceful trading expedition carrying supplies for their families. Captain Taffanel's convoy was proceeding along a route that would bring them to Deer Creek, at precisely the moment when these conflicting objectives would create inevitable violence. The boy spent the final days before the massacre in a state of heightened anticipation that he would later describe as the most exhilarating experience of his young life. Jonas had created a situation where experienced military commanders and veteran warriors would destroy each other through their own tactical competence. Each group's success in achieving their perceived objectives guaranteed to result in catastrophic failure for everyone involved. On the evening of November 22nd, Jonas made his final preparations for observing the results of months of careful manipulation. The boy positioned himself at a location overlooking Deer Creek. where he could witness the convergence of forces he had orchestrated while remaining safely distant from the violence that would follow. As he watched the first French scouts establish their positions along the creek, Jonas felt a sense of godlike satisfaction that would remain unmatched throughout his brief but bloody career. Tomorrow would bring the culmination of his greatest achievement. Proof that an 11-year-old boy, armed with nothing more than carefully chosen words, could orchestrate military disasters that would kill dozens of experienced soldiers and warriors. As autumn deepened into winter, Jonas Creighton's appetite for manipulation had grown beyond mere profit. The 11-year-old had discovered something more intoxicating than money, the godlike power to determine who lived and who died with nothing more than carefully placed words. His masterpiece began with intelligence about a French supply convoy travelling south from Montreal. Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel was leading 40 soldiers and a baggage train loaded with winter supplies for French forts throughout the region. The convoy represented a legitimate military target, but Jonas saw it as something more, an opportunity to orchestrate the most devastating misunderstanding of his brief but bloody career. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Mohawk Valley intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content.